Thank you for joining us again for another update from the Soybean Extension Program. Today we're going to discuss the topic of managing early maturing soybeans in North Carolina, and we're defining early maturing soybeans as maturity groups 3 and 4 for this state. Before we get into the discussion about managing these earlier maturing varieties, let's go back to the fundamentals. What is a soybean maturity group? A soybean maturity group is a latitudinal zone that was developed to say where a soybean genetic package best fits based on photoperiod or night length and the interaction with temperature. So if you look at North Carolina in this traditional model released in the 1970s, you can see that we were slated to best produce a maturity group 6 soybean. But we know we've got growers across the state successfully producing maturity groups 3 through 8. I'll also bring your attention to the Mississippi Delta area where they were traditionally slated to maximally produce a maturity group 6 through maturity group 8 soybean variety. But many growers in that region have successfully shifted production to maturity groups 3 and 4 varieties, and that has resulted in some considerable yield increases in that area. Another important piece of vocabulary involving these earlier maturing varieties is the difference between a determinate and indeterminate variety. A determinate variety is one that stops most vegetative growth when the plant starts flowering. This is generally maturity group 5 or greater, and traditionally this has been most of the soybean varieties produced in the South. When we talk about these maturity groups 3 and 4 soybean varieties, you're going to hear the word indeterminate, which are soybean varieties that are capable of flowering and growing vegetatively at the same time for several weeks, what should result in a slightly longer flowering period. These are generally maturity groups 4 or less, although you can find some indeterminate early to mid 5s, and these are most soybean varieties produced in the Midwest. So the research question then becomes, how do these indeterminate maturity groups 3 and 4 soybeans fit across North Carolina, a state where we've traditionally produced more determinate varieties? Many progressive growers in parts of the state have already answered the question that these earlier maturing varieties can be successfully produced in North Carolina. If we look at the 2018 North Carolina's soybean yield contest results as an example, we can see that about 80% of the growers that entered the contest in 2018 were using indeterminate maturity group 3 or 4 varieties. 2018 was an interesting year to be getting started with this research because it seems some of the advantages and disadvantages of growing these earlier maturing soybeans in North Carolina really played out. So what are some of those advantages? Are the genetics better? If you think about where the majority of the indeterminate maturity group 3 and 4 soybeans are grown in the United States, it's up in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, places that produce a lot of soybeans. And if I was a soybean breeder, I would be very invested in my genetics for those maturity groups being excellent. We have growers in North Carolina that can get a price premium for early soybean delivery, which is facilitated by the earlier harvest of these early maturing soybeans. And speaking of early harvest, that can be an advantage in some circumstances. So we have a few growers that had their soybeans harvested before the hurricanes came through in 2018. And in that case, that early harvest window is an advantage. The early harvest window can also be a disadvantage. If you think about it, these soybeans are coming into physiological maturity in late August into September when it's often hot, humid, and wet, and this can lead to seed quality issues. We had reports from across the state in 2018 about green stem issues in a wide range of soybean maturity groups, but we seem to have more prevalent reports of this issue with indeterminate varieties. We talked about how harvest timing can be a disadvantage from a weather perspective. Hurricanes are rolling through often when these soybeans are coming into physiological maturity. But harvest timing can also be a disadvantage with these earlier maturing soybeans for our growers that have more complex rotations. Because of the seed quality issue, timely harvest with these maturity groups is really critical. And some of our growers cannot prioritize soybean harvest in September or early October when there's a lot of other things going on with their rotations. So knowing there's a lot of interest in managing earlier maturing soybeans across North Carolina, we had some progressive county extension agents out east start some fundamental agronomic research with these earlier maturing soybeans, and Ryan Heiniger and I got involved to make sure some of this work was replicated in the Piedmont. So in 2018 we were looking at some really fundamental agronomics of these earlier maturing varieties. What's the optimum row spacing and seeding rate? And through this research, can we identify trends that we've not identified in our previous work in the soybean extension program, which has focused largely on managing determinate soybean varieties. Another question we were looking at is soil applied fertility out at beginning flowering. We know as we're trying to push soybean yields higher that soybean fertility may be more of an emphasis than it has in the past. And we have a limited data set on planting date work from 2018, but we're greatly expanding that in the upcoming years. So I want to run through some highlights of this research in 2018. We looked at most of this agronomic research with two varieties, Pioneer 38T42 and Asgrow 48X7, across our various counties where this research was conducted. And if you combine over those varieties and combine over the counties, 15-inch row spacing provided about a 7 bushel per acre yield advantage over 30-inch row spacing. If you look within the individual counties, this phenomenon was more pronounced in some of our high-yielding situations, like Dillon County and Rowan County with that Pioneer variety, where we saw about a 15 bushel per acre yield advantage from the 15-inch row spacing compared to the 30-inch row spacing. If you look at some of these other environments, you can see there's no yield differences amongst the two row spacings. So I think this aligns nicely with what Dr. Dunphy has found in determinate varieties for row spacing across the state, in that narrow rows will often provide a yield advantage, but not always, and you're more likely to see that yield advantage in a high yielding environment. What about seeding rate? Everyone is familiar with the very robust data set that Dr. Dunphy has generated on appropriate seeding rates for soybeans in North Carolina. But what about when we're looking at early planted indeterminate varieties? This graph is combined over our two varieties that we looked at in our multiple research sites in 2018. We've got seeding rate on the x-axis and yield on the y-axis. And in this research, we saw that yield tended to stabilize at about 120,000 seeds per acre and above. And we saw yield declines definitely at the 60 to 80,000 seeds per acre range, but also slightly lower yields at that 100,000 seeds per acre range. I already mentioned that one topic of interest was looking at soil applied R1 fertility applications. So if we look at nutrient uptake in soybeans, these graphs are from Dr. Fred Below and his team at the University of Illinois. We can see that nutrient uptake for potassium and phosphorus in this case explodes in soybeans at beginning flowering. So knowing that, the county agents wanted to ask, well, what is the value of soil applied R1 fertility applications as we're trying to push soybean yields higher? There were various nutrients that were looked at, from nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and a combination of those nutrients applied at beginning flowering. And there was no yield differences compared to the non-treated check from these R1 fertility applications in 2018. We'll continue to gather some more data in this space in 2019, but these preliminary results would indicate that while soybean fertility will likely be a larger focus as we push soybean yields higher, the R1 soil applied time frame is likely not the answer. What about the optimal planting date for these earlier maturing varieties? This is likely the most important agronomic question involving this research, and in 2018 we have a pretty limited data set. We were able to look at some planting dates in some of these counties, comparing early May to early June to early July. At some sites, the May and June planting dates yielded comparably. At some sites, the May planting date out-yielded the June planting date. Across most sites, the July planting date yielded less, and that's simply because when these early maturing soybeans are planted late, in July, for example, there's not much time for the plant to put on a lot of vegetative growth before it starts flowering. We need to do more research in this space, and one project that we've got going on in the soybean extension program in 2019 and moving forward is looking at trying to identify the optimal maturity group across a wide range in planting dates. So this year we started planting in mid-March. We planted maturity groups 2 through 8 at those early planting dates, and we'll plant through mid-August, again with that same maturity group range, to try to say how early can these maturity groups be successfully planted, but also how late can they be successfully planted. We have some growers that are now pretty successfully planting maturity group 4, mid to late 4 in a double crop situation, and we want to see how late can you push that planting date and still see these early maturing varieties perform competitively with determinate varieties which have more generally been produced in that space. I just wanted to provide a few pictures on some of our seed quality issues that we saw in our research trials with these early maturing varieties in 2018. I mentioned that seed quality can be an issue, and we definitely saw that in our trials. You can visit our research publication, which is available on the Soybean Extension portal, to see data about some of this damage across our different agronomic practices. Again, a more comprehensive research summary on these trials can be found on the Soybean Extension portal. Many of the county agents that are involved in this research plan to continue some of this research in 2019, and we will have some accompanying research in the Soybean Extension program in 2019 moving forward. I've already mentioned our large trial looking at identifying the optimum maturity group across a wide range in planting date. We've also got some work with maturity group 3 and 4 and 5 soybeans planted early from mid-March to mid-August to mid-May to see at those earlier planting dates how important is a fungicidal seed treatment. So stay tuned for those results, and thank you for plugging in.